I found the briefcase 3 weeks after we buried my husband's father sitting in the back of his study closet, where nobody had touched it since the funeral. Inside, under a stack of old tax returns, was a folder of bank statements from an account I'd never seen going back 3 years every single month, showing the same transfer labeled simply rent, going to an address I didn't recognize, and a name that definitely wasn't mine. What I didn't know yet, holding those papers in a dead man's study, was that my job had trained me to read exactly this kind of document faster than anyone in my husband's life ever expected me to. If you've ever found the proof of something you weren't supposed to find, stay with me, because this story ends with a very specific kind of confrontation. And if these stories are why you keep coming back, go ahead and subscribe now. My name is Maren. I've spent 9 years as a leasing and property manager for a mid-sized real estate firm, which means I read rental paperwork the way most people read a grocery list. And 3 weeks after my father-in-law's funeral, that exact skill was about to become the only thing standing between me and a lie my husband had been telling for 3 years. Derek and I had been married 6 years when his father Walt passed away after a short illness that nobody, including Walt, seemed to fully take seriously until it was too late. Walt had been a quiet private man, a retired postal worker, who kept his own counsel and his own paperwork, the kind of person who paid bills by check, well into an era when everyone else had gone digital. He and Derek were close in the specific, undemonstrative way fathers and sons sometimes are fishing trips twice a year. Sunday phone calls that lasted exactly the length of a football quarter, not much said, plenty understood. I run leasing operations for 11 properties across our city, which means I spend my days reading lease agreements, rent rolls, and tenant payment histories for a living. I can look at a stack of financial paperwork and understand within minutes what most people would need a forensic accountant to explain to them: which line items are routine, which ones are unusual, and which ones are the specific shape of someone trying not to be noticed. I didn't think much about that skill applying to my own marriage. You don't expect to need your job inside your own home. I got into property management almost by accident, actually, 12 years ago. Taking an entry-level leasing job while I finished a degree I eventually abandoned for the career itself. What kept me in it wasn't the properties, it was the paperwork, oddly enough. I liked the specific satisfaction of a rent roll that reconciled perfectly of catching a tenant's forged pay stub before it caused a problem 6 months down the line of understanding a building's entire financial health just by reading its payment history closely enough. Derek used to tease me gently about how much I talked about spreadsheets at dinner. I never imagined that exact habit would eventually be the thing that unraveled my own marriage instead of someone else's lease. Walt's death hit Derek harder than either of us expected. He handled the funeral logistics with a kind of brisk efficiency that I recognized as grief wearing a competent mask. And for weeks afterward, he avoided going through his father's study, the small back room in Walt's house where he'd kept his desk, his filing cabinet, and apparently a briefcase that had sat closed and forgotten in the closet for longer than either of us realized. I remember thinking in those early weeks after the funeral that Derek's grief looked almost identical to how he'd handled every difficult thing in our 6 years together: organize the logistics, keep busy, avoid sitting still long enough to actually feel anything. I'd always assumed that was just his temperament, a practical man who processed things through action rather than conversation. I didn't yet understand that this same instinct applied elsewhere in his life had let him maintain something far more complicated than grief for 3 straight years, without either of us discussing it once. I offered to help sort through Walt's belongings, mostly because Derek seemed frozen every time he tried to start, and grief has a way of making even simple tasks feel impossible. 3 weeks after the funeral on a Saturday, Derek had reluctantly agreed to spend at his father's house. I found myself alone in the study, while he dealt with movers in the garage going through a closet nobody had opened yet. The briefcase was on the top shelf. Dusty, unremarkable. The kind of thing you'd assume held old tax documents and nothing more interesting than that. The house itself felt strange to be in without Walt somewhere in it, the particular stillness of a home whose owner is gone, but whose belongings haven't caught up to that fact yet. His reading glasses were still on the side table. A half-finished crossword sat on the kitchen counter folded to a page dated the week before he died. I remember thinking at the time that going through his study felt like the last real act of care I could offer him, sorting his life into what mattered and what didn't. I had no idea I was about to find something that would sort my own life the same way. I almost didn't open it. I want to be honest about that. It felt like an invasion of a dead man's privacy, sorting through papers that weren't mine to sort through. But Derek had asked me specifically to flag anything that looked like it needed his attention: insurance documents, unpaid bills, anything with a deadline attached, and the briefcase sitting untouched in a closet seemed like exactly the kind of place that might hold something urgent. Inside were mostly what I expected: old tax returns, an expired passport, a stack of postcards from a trip to the Grand Canyon decades earlier. But underneath the tax returns was a manila folder, unlabeled, thicker than the rest, held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. Inside that folder were bank statements from an account I didn't recognize, a joint account apparently opened at a small regional bank. Neither Derek nor I had ever mentioned banking with mailed to Walt's address rather than ours. I want to explain something about how leasing paperwork works, because it's the reason I understood what I was looking at faster than I think most people would have. Every month, the statements showed the exact same transaction, same day of the month, same dollar amount, $1,800 memo line, simply reading rent. Rent payments have a very specific shape when you've spent 9 years reading them, professionally recurring, consistent, tied to a lease cycle, rather than a mortgage or a loan payment which have their own distinct patterns. This was rent. Someone was paying rent monthly for 3 straight years, and the account doing the paying had Derek's name on it alongside Walt's, opened 5 years earlier and apparently used specifically for this single recurring purpose. I flipped through the statements twice, checking dates against each other the way I'd check a rent roll for a property before a sale closes. There was no gap, no missed month, no late payment fee. The kind of unbroken consistency that only comes from something being treated as a genuine priority rather than an occasional indulgence. Whoever was on the receiving end of this account had never once had to wonder if the payment would arrive on time. I sat on the floor of Walt's study for a long time, the folder open in my lap, doing the math I do professionally almost every day of my life, except this time the numbers belonged to my own marriage. 36 payments. $64,800. 3 years almost to the exact month we'd celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary, a trip to the coast Derek had paid for, that I remembered specifically because he'd told me money was tight that year. I remember staring at that specific overlap for a long time, the coast trip, the year he'd told me we needed to be careful with spending the same year. This account was already sending $1,800 out every single month without fail. I'd believed him. I'd suggested a cheaper hotel that year to help. I sat with that particular detail longer than almost anything else in the folder. I didn't say anything to Derek that day. I've learned professionally that confronting someone about a discrepancy before you understand its full shape usually just teaches them to hide the next one better. So I photographed every statement on my phone, put the folder back exactly where I'd found it, and drove home that night, running scenarios I didn't want to be running. The address on the statements listed as the recipient's mailing address for a linked secondary account was an apartment complex I actually knew professionally. Renfield Commons, a mid-size building our firm had done a market comparison on 2 years earlier when a client considered acquiring it. I had access to public property records through my job, the same kind of access I use to verify tenant histories and ownership structures for due diligence. It took me 11 minutes to find the current leaseholder of record for the unit tied to that address. The name was Simone Alvarez. I sat at my desk at work the following Monday, supposedly reviewing quarterly vacancy reports, and instead found myself staring at that name on my screen for longer than I want to admit. Simone Alvarez. I ran a basic search, the kind I do reflexively for any name that crosses my desk professionally, and found a modest social media presence, a woman roughly my own age, a graphic designer based in the same city I'd lived in my entire married life, without ever once crossing her path as far as I knew. I didn't recognize the name. I sat with that for 3 days, watching Derek move through our house like nothing had changed, making coffee, asking about my day, sleeping beside me, while I carried 36 months of rent payments in my phone's photo album like a small, silent weight. Before I tell you what happened when I finally said her name out loud, I want to know if you found 3 years of secret payments in a dead relative's belongings. Would you have confronted your spouse immediately or built the full picture first the way I did? Tell me in the comments. What made this harder to untangle than a simple discovery was Derek's sister Nora, who called me 4 days after I found the briefcase, ostensibly to check in about how I was handling Walt's estate paperwork, since I'd been the one organizing most of it. Nora and I had always been friendly, if not especially close, and her call felt at first like ordinary grief-adjacent kindness. We talked for a few minutes about the practical things, the estate lawyer, the house listing, whether Derek was sleeping. Then the conversation kept circling back to strange specifics. Had I gone through all of Dad's old files yet? Had I found anything unusual in his study? She asked twice in slightly different ways whether Derek and I had discussed any of Dad's old arrangements. I answered vaguely, both times some instinct, telling me not to reveal what I'd found until I understood who already knew about it. It was the third question that told me everything. Derek probably explained the account situation to you already, right? She said, too casually, the kind of casual that's been rehearsed. I said nothing for a moment, and in that silence, Nora made a small, sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone realizing they'd said too much. Nora, I said slowly, what account situation? She backpedaled, immediately said she'd misspoken, said she was just tired from the estate stuff too, and got off the phone quickly after that. But I understood in that moment that Nora had known about this for some time, possibly years, and had called me not entirely out of concern for my grief, but to quietly gauge how much I'd already discovered before anyone had to decide what to do about it. I sat with that phone call for 2 full days before doing anything else. It wasn't just Derek anymore. It was Derek and his sister, and possibly his father too, before he died, a small, quiet network of people who'd known something about my own marriage that I hadn't been allowed access to. I thought about every family dinner over the past 3 years, every holiday where Nora had sat across the table from me knowing. I thought too about Walt, specifically a man I'd genuinely loved as a father-in-law, gentle and quiet, in a way that had always felt safe to be around. I didn't know, and still don't fully know, how much he understood about what that account was actually funding. Some part of me hopes he never knew the full truth. Another part of me wonders if his quiet nature, the same quality I'd always admired, was exactly what let this go unspoken in his own house for years. I called our firm's title research contact the next day, a woman named Priya I'd worked with for years, verifying property ownership on complicated transactions, and asked her informally to run a broader record search on Simone Alvarez. Not obsessively, not like a private investigator, just the kind of basic public records literacy my job gives me access to every single day. Priya didn't ask many questions. In our line of work, discretion is part of the job description, and she pulled the records the same afternoon. What came back was a lease history showing Simone Alvarez had lived at 3 different addresses over those 3 years, and at every single one, the secondary authorized occupant listed on the lease, the person with a key and permission to be there, was Derek. 3 leases, 3 renewals, 3 separate move-ins, each one carefully updated to keep the paper trail routed through Walt's mailing address rather than mine. I sat with that printout for a long time. This wasn't a single indiscretion or a brief lapse in judgment. This was a second household quietly maintained, moved, and renewed across 3 different leases, funded through an account specifically routed through his dead father's mailing address, so it would never once cross my own bank statements or my own mail. 3 years of a life I had no idea was running parallel to my own, updated and renewed with the same careful consistency I'd admired professionally in 100 other people's paperwork. I didn't confront Derek at home. I asked him to meet me at Walt's house, instead the study, specifically on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after I'd found the briefcase. I wanted him standing in the exact room where I'd found the proof, not in a space where he could retreat to some comfortable, rehearsed version of denial. I'd spent those 2 weeks doing what I always do before a difficult tenant conversation at work, gathering every document, organizing it in the order I'd present it, making sure nothing I said would rely on memory alone when paper could say it more precisely. I laid the bank statements out on Walt's old desk, 36 of them alongside Priya's lease history printout. 2 documents side by side, his father's quiet paper trail on one side, 3 years of someone else's address on the other. Derek walked in a few minutes after I did, and I watched him notice the desk before he noticed me, his face shifting the moment he understood what was laid out on it. "I need you to explain this," I said, and slid the folder toward him. Derek's face went through something complicated, not quite surprise. More like a man watching a door he'd kept locked for years finally swing open on its own. "Where did you find this?" "In your father's closet," I said. "Which is a strange place to keep proof of something you were hiding from me unless you needed his address specifically so I'd never see it." "It's not what it looks like," he started, and I actually laughed a short, humorless sound because I've heard that exact sentence from tenants trying to explain away a lease violation more times than I can count, and it has never once in 9 years preceded something that turned out to be innocent. 36 payments, I said. $1,800 a month. 3 different addresses, and at every single one you're listed as the authorized secondary occupant. That's not a misunderstanding, Derek. That's a second home. You don't understand the whole situation, he said, his voice rising slightly. Then explain the whole situation, I said, keeping my own voice level. Because right now what I understand is a joint account opened 5 years ago, routed through your father's address, paying rent for a woman named Simone Alvarez at 3 different apartments over 3 years. Tell me what part of that I'm misunderstanding. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the statements instead of at me running his thumb along the edge of the folder, the way he does when he's stalling for time. He knows he doesn't actually have. It started before we got married, he said finally, and something in my chest went very still. Not the account, the relationship. It was already there. I thought it would end on its own. It didn't. I hadn't expected that timeline, and it took me a moment to absorb it. So this predates us, I said slowly. It complicated everything after he said. I kept telling myself I'd fix it before the wedding. Then I told myself I'd fix it before our first anniversary. Then it just became something I managed instead of something I ended. He sat down heavily in his father's old desk chair, and for a moment something genuine crossed his face. Not performance, not damage control. Something closer to exhaustion, like a man finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long, he'd forgotten how heavy it was. I didn't know how to stop, he said quietly. It started small, and then it didn't feel like something I could undo without losing everything, so I just kept paying for it instead. For one brief moment I felt something close to sympathy, watching him look genuinely lost in his own father's chair, a man who'd clearly spent 3 years trapped inside a lie of his own construction. Then he added, I never stopped loving you, Maren. This doesn't have to change us if we don't let it, and the sympathy evaporated because even sitting in the wreckage of his own choices, he was still trying to manage the outcome instead of actually reckoning with what he'd done. You used your father's address to hide this from me for 3 years, I said. You didn't just betray me, you used a dying man's mail to do it. Did he know? Did Walt know what that account was actually for? Derek's silence answered before he did. He knew there was an account, he finally said. I don't think he knew exactly what it was funding. I think he assumed it was something else. I never corrected him. Nora, it turned out, had known for almost 2 of those 3 years Derek had confided in her after a close call when I'd almost found a receipt. She never told me. She'd called me 4 days after the funeral, not to comfort me, but to find out how close I already was to knowing. Does Nora know I found this? I asked. I told her you'd been going through Dad's things, he said. I didn't know you'd found the folder specifically until right now. I didn't stay to hear whatever else Derek wanted to say. I picked up the folder, left the lease printout on the desk for him, and drove home alone the same way I'd driven home the night I first found the briefcase, except this time the silence in the car felt different, not confused anymore, just clear. I used to think that trust meant not needing to double-check the people you loved. What that briefcase taught me is that the truth doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly in a dead man's closet for weeks, waiting for someone who knows how to actually read it. Derek and I are separated now, the divorce still working its way through the paperwork slower and messier than either of us would like. We haven't spoken much beyond what the lawyers require, and I've stopped expecting the kind of full accounting I once thought I deserved from him. Some people I've learned will manage a situation right up until the very end, rather than actually own it, and I've made peace with the fact that Derek is one of them. Nora and I don't speak much anymore, which I've made peace with too. She sent one text a few weeks after everything came out, saying she was sorry for not telling me sooner that she'd been trying to protect the family, whatever that meant to her at the time. I didn't reply. Some apologies arrived too late to actually change anything, and I didn't feel obligated to pretend otherwise just to make the silence between us more comfortable for her. I still don't know very much about Simone Alvarez, and I've decided I don't need to. I don't think she owes me anything, honestly. I don't know what Derek told her, what she believed about his life, whether she knew about me at all. That's a different story than mine, and I've let it stay that way. I still do the same job I did before any of this happened, reading other people's rental histories every day, and I won't pretend there isn't a strange, specific irony in that. Some skills you build for one part of your life end up mattering in places you never expected them to. I keep the folder of statements in my own filing cabinet now, not out of spite, but because old habits are hard to break. You document what matters, whether or not you ever plan to use it again. If you've ever found proof of something you weren't supposed to find sitting quietly in the last place you'd think to look, I want to hear about it. Tell me what happened in the comments below. If this story hit close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how carefully someone tries to route around it. And if you want more stories exactly like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because next week's story might be the one that feels like it was written about your own life.